We're very happy to welcome Michael Duerksen as our first keynote speaker to kick off the conference. Michael is the founder and CEO of Build Good, a company that helps nonprofits do their best job of telling stories to raise funds. He's on a mission to help nonprofits build predictable fundraising success by focusing on donor needs, identities, and values. He also hosts a podcast, the Build Good Fundraising Podcast, and co-hosts the Donor Growth Podcast. So, Michael, I will turn it over to you.
Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to commend you for being here, communing together as a group to figure out where philanthropy is going, where building a broad base of donors is going, is in my opinion, a really good investment of your time. And it's also super important. I want to set the stage a little bit for the conference today, in that this is one of the most important things you can do, because I actually think that we're at a critical strategic inflection point. And I'm going to get into what I mean by that. For those of us who are listening to this later on audio, we're coming from an old paradigm and we're going toward a new paradigm. And there's a horizontal line that goes straight across the screen, and it's flat and it's going left to right. And at some point, there's an inflection point and the line splits in two. And one line curves down and the other one curves up. And the new paradigm is the line that's curving up, and the old paradigm is the status quo that rejected change and that slowly will be on the decline. And as those two lines start to diverge, it becomes very easy to spot the difference. But in the beginning, when you're sort of right in that gray zone, it's not entirely clear what the new paradigm is or what the old paradigm is. It might not even be clear that we're at a strategic inflection point. But based on our work, based on our research, based on what we're seeing, I want to make the case for you today that right now we're at a moment in time, at a moment in culture where we have to make some really important decisions, and we have to make them pretty quickly. There's three worrying trends, so to speak, that is facing our sector. This is what's changing. This is what keeps me up at night. And I hope that after today, it'll keep you up at night too. Not because I don't want you to have a good night's sleep, but because I want you to think about this deeply with senior leadership. Number one is the decline of trust in society. Number two is the decline of donor participation in our organizations. And number three, it's not a worrying trend. It's just the information gap is shrinking. It's shrinking quickly. And the way that we as organizations respond to that new reality, that is what's worrying me. So let's get into it. We need to talk about this cultural moment that we're in. The Edelman Trust Barometer, many of you are familiar with it. It tracks trust in society. Business in many countries is now the most trusted institution. And in fact, business is now seen as the only institution that is both competent and ethical. So the nonprofit sector has lost a little bit of ground here. You'll see according to their tracking, people now see NGOs as a little bit more ethical than before, but as less competent. People have lost most trust in governments, and people are losing a lot of trust in the media. So if you think about the context that our donors are living in right now, is that they're trusting institutions as a general rule of thumb, they're trusting institutions less and less. And whether you like it or not, we are often seen as institutions. As much as we try to break down that narrative, sometimes we're just seen as institutions. They're dealing with record inflation. Most donors in the US and in Canada are above the age of 40. In fact, most are above the age of 65. So they've seen this story before. They've lived through an inflation crisis in the 80s. They've lived through the 08-09 crisis, and it's happening again. Many of them are on a fixed income, or many of them are towards the end of their working life. And even though they might have good retirement accounts, even though they might be okay financially speaking, they're having this feeling of, well, all I've got is this. Even if this is a lot of money, all I've got is this. I'm starting to only live on this. And what if this thing keeps going? What if we're heading for 5 years of a terrible economy? What if interest rates stay really high for a long time, right? So they're dealing with inflation. Conspiracy theories are mainstream because everyone is a publisher, which is an amazing thing. It also means that everyone is a publisher. That means that the crazy uncle that shows up at Thanksgiving dinner, he's also a publisher. That means that the people you vehemently disagree with, they're also a publisher. It means the people that deal in misinformation, they're also a publisher. Everyone's a publisher. And so conspiracy theories are kind of mainstream. The internet feels like a drunken barroom fight. It is very, very hard to disagree well these days, especially on the internet. It very quickly turns into a very polarized and highly, highly charged conversation. That does affect the way that we see the world, especially as more and more of us live online, essentially, including our parents and grandparents who are going on Facebook to look for pictures of the grandkids. This is no longer just like, oh, the millennials, right? No, like everyone is glued to their phone. We've lost the ability to disagree well. Some would argue that we never had it, that this, the last 10 to 20 years, because everyone is a publisher, it's just amplified the fact that we never had the ability to disagree well. And we've become a little bit less trusting of each other, which is entirely normal in times of uncertainty. When things are uncertain, people pull in a little bit closer to the things that they know. They hold on a little bit tighter to what they know is certain. People get a little bit more tribal. It's normal behavior, but it does mean that trust in society is down. Now, our number one jobs as fundraisers, as communicators, as nonprofit leaders, is then to build trust, which creates future value for our organization. Number one job, the nonprofit leader, is to create future value for the organization. And the way we do that is by building trust. So if you're thinking, oh man, what am I going to do for the next 2 years if the economy really does tank like some people say it will, right? If you're having those conversations now, it's great that you're thinking about it, but the stuff that really makes a difference, that's the trust building you've done over the last 5 years. If you haven't been doing that, then you're way too late. That's not to say that there aren't things you can do, and we're going to get into some of those later. And throughout the course of this conference, you're going to hear about a bunch of those things. But trust is a process that takes consistency over time. That's what we're called to do. Many of you may have a donor base where giving was part of a religious obligation, or it was part of a religious ritual. It was something that was expected. It was something that was modeled at home religiously by parents and grandparents. It was something that was baked into community. But those days are over. The days of expecting donors to just give because it's the right thing to do, they're over. They've been over for a while. In fact, data shows that in less than 50 years, the percentage of the population who gives to charity could be in the single digits. And that is not to be doom and gloom. It's not to scare anybody. It's just we need to be really clear-eyed about what's happening and what we're up against. So across the board, donor participation is down, right? It's down 50% in the last 30 years. It's down 30% in the last 15 years alone. Those of you who are representing universities and higher ed or schools, even alumni donor participation, which there's a strong relation to identity. I went to this place. I had some of the best memories of my life in this place. I met my partner in this place. This place has shaped how I view the world. It has formed some of my values. Alumni donor participation has just about halved in the last 2 decades. Total giving as part of GDP, I'm sure all of you know this, it's just stuck. It's stuck at less than 2% of GDP. By the way, same story. Canada, US, UK, Australia, all these countries that have fairly mature fundraising markets, giving as a percentage of the GDP has largely remain unchanged. Now, there were some gains in giving during COVID. That was very clear. It was very apparent. The data is very clear about that. But those gains are now flattened by inflation. And even if we didn't have inflation, we don't really know if that pace of giving would have sustained into the future. For our Canadian friends, this chart is kind of what nightmares are made of. I'll just quickly walk you through it. The orange line that is declining rapidly, and that's been kind of in free fall for the last 20 years. Those are the amount of people who are claiming a charitable donation on their tax filing. It's important to remember that in Canada, it's very advantageous to claim giving on your taxes. I know in the US, since a few years ago, those deductions don't mean as much anymore, and some people are carrying them forward and doing other stuff. In Canada, though, that's not the case. Every year, you get your deductions for that year. So this is not related to policy change. This is entirely related to fewer people actually claiming charitable giving on their taxes because fewer people are giving. The black dotted line is the average donation. Sometime in, between 2000 and 2005, those two lines intersected, and we haven't recovered since. We're relying on fewer and fewer people to do more and more of the giving. Every single year, we are relying on fewer and fewer people to do more and more of the giving. Now, the information gap is shrinking, or better said, it's basically gone. And like I said, this is not necessarily a bad thing. But some decades ago, organizations had information that donors were interested in. Institutions had information that citizens were interested in. What is the case for tuning in to CNN to see what's going on in Ukraine at the moment when Ukrainian soldiers are posting videos on Twitter? Everyone has almost the same access to information. Same goes for your nonprofit. Some of you who, Oxfam used to tell us what was happening in Ethiopia or Iran, and now in Iran, people are taking to social media and it's coming across my LinkedIn feed. People have become very online, which is a great thing. People have become very used to finding instantaneous information, which is a great thing. It's just how do we respond to that? That is a little bit worrying, because here's the old way. Here's the old way that organizations, institutions, nonprofits, universities, charities, this is the old way that we used to think of this. The message that we were putting out there was highly controlled. We controlled the narrative. We controlled the message. Kind of had this mindset of, command and control. Because the way people heard about us was through mediums that oftentimes we had some control over. Of course, with earned media, that was never really the case. But even so, we had PR people, we had spin masters. People talked about how are we going to spin this? People talked about what angle are we going to give the reporter? It was mainly a one-way broadcast. And by the way, that includes email. It includes social ads. It includes all the other things that we're doing online today. Some organizations still have this mindset that it's mainly a one-way broadcast. The tools have changed. The tactics have changed. The mindset hasn't really. It's non-responsive. It was very scheduled and planned. We have quarterly themes and we stick to them. We have an annual report that goes out in the fall. And that's when we update donors on everything that's happened in the last 12 months. We thought a lot about what we want to say. It's low context. The implication is I know better than you. Now, I don't mean that in a negative way, not necessarily paternalistic. It's just, I know better than you. I have all this information. I literally know better than you. And I'm going to disseminate this information to let you have access to it. Stewardship was fairly basic, and it was focused on short-term results. We got the term annual fund out of this. I think the annual fund needs to die. It was all about getting that annual gift from a donor. Oftentimes, it was pandering to major donors. Major donors held all the power. They held all the money. They still do. Storytelling was sometimes unethical because it was done in the spirit of pandering. Oftentimes, we ignored mass and mid-level donors. And a lot of focus was on telling our story well. How do we tell the story of our organization really well? How do we do that, right? So this is the old paradigm. And I don't mean old paradigm as in people are no longer doing things this way. A lot of organizations are still doing things this way. I mean the old paradigm as in what got us here isn't going to get us there. So then on the way to the new paradigm, there's been some shifts, right? So if the old paradigm was sort of this red light, on the way to the new paradigm, now we're kind of at yellow. Organizations started to become and have started to become media and content machines. I think this is overall a very positive thing. Some large organizations jumped on the acquisition hamster wheel. It became very easy to rent lists. It became very easy to target demographics on Facebook. That's become a lot harder now since Cambridge Analytica. But large organizations spent a lot of money on acquiring new donors, and they got on this hamster wheel of just acquiring new donors, with the mindset of, if we can capture the imagination and the attention of donors like we would if they were consumers, right? So borrowing heavily from the commercial sector, and the mindset is that the best story wins, right? We can tell a really great story, the best story is going to win, and the goal was to build an engaged audience. And we see fundraising as a funnel. We dump 2,000 donors in the top of the funnel. We start moving them through the funnel, different tactics, different messages, trying to get gift upgrades, trying to do that. A lot of people are going to like fall out of the funnel, but then in mid funnel, we're going to retain some, and then bottom of the funnel, we're going to have some true believers who are going to stick with us. Now, I'm not attaching a value statement here. I think some of these strategies are by and large helpful, can be successful. I just don't think that they are sustainable in any way. So the new paradigm, the new way, is organizations inviting participation, having a goal of retention. So our community, the folks who are with us, the folks who we want to attract, we want to attract true believers. We want to repel the rest. We want to attract true believers, people who align with our values, people who care about the same things that we care about. And we're going to resource our fundraising and communications and marketing and outreach efforts, our engagement efforts. We're going to resource them by playing the long game, because we want to take somebody from being a first-time giver to becoming a legacy leaver. That's what we're interested in. Because if we say fundraising and building organizations is all about relationships, and we say that all the time, it's all about relationships, it's all about relationships. What are the most fruitful relationships in your life? They're relationships for life. They have ups and downs. You're not thinking about a 1-year relationship, a 2-year relationship. You're thinking about a relationship that's going to be sustained for a very long time, and that requires investment. It requires tending to. There's an ebb and a flow. Sometimes you're going to be a little bit closer. Sometimes you're going to feel a little bit further apart. When you feel further apart, you're going to put some effort in to make it work, right? It's going to be a dynamic relationship. But that's how we should think about when we're inviting participation from donors. We're inviting people into a story where they are active participants and citizens, not consumers. So they have a specific and meaningful role to play in our organizations. We're going to ask for mind share before we ask for wallet share. We might ask for wallet share too. I'm all here for asking people for money, right? But we got to ask for mind share as well. We got to let them know that we also care about what their thoughts are. We're not just after their wallet. Stewardship is focused on donor lifetime value. And the goal here is to build what my friend and colleague Luis Diaz calls a community of purpose. The goal is not necessarily to build a list. It's not even necessary to build an audience. It's to build a community. And fundraising is not seen as a funnel. Fundraising is seen as a flywheel. And I'm going to get into what we mean by that. So what does telling stories in new ways look like? That's the theme of the conference. It's what you're all here to explore. I'm not going to get into tactics and tools and channels in this keynote. We do have a workshop later, and I know you've got lots of content lined up that's going to focus on that. From a strategy perspective, what does that look like? From a mindset perspective, what does that look like? What should we be thinking about? It's really involving our community of supporters in writing their own life story. And what I mean by that is we want to be a meaningful part of their life, where being involved with organizations is part of who they are. And it's part of them becoming the best version of themselves. It's being generous enough to help donors become who they seek to become. It's showing up with generosity to help our community of supporters become who they seek to become. Now, I want to make a very clear distinction here between treating donors as saviors, which is sometimes called the savior complex, and giving donors a meaningful and specific role to play. Because oftentimes the problem is not that we have centered the donor too much, or that we haven't centered the people we're helping enough. It's that we've centered our own organization too much. We do this, we do that. Everything is about us, 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 us. It's arrogant. It leaves no room for the people we're helping, and it also leaves no room for the donor. And if we're being honest with ourselves, we're kind of just a vessel. We're kind of just a conduit, right? That kind of connects people who want to be generous, who want to live out their values with the people that we're helping and the people that they want to help, or the cause they want to help. And so if we see ourselves as servant leaders, that's our job, is to make that connection, and is to build a community of supporters who care about the same things. Why is that important? Well, look at this research. This research is, there's other research studies out there. This one is from Impacts. There's a few other studies out there looking at this exact same question. Why did you not make another donation? Why did you stop giving? By and large, from all the research, these reasons, in some research, one reason ranks a little bit higher than the other. By and large, the research is conclusive that these are the top reasons why donors stop giving. I wasn't thanked for my previous gift. I wasn't asked to donate again. I didn't know what my gift did. Nobody communicated with me. I didn't know what the impact was or the outcome was. I forgot to give. Very honest answer. I gave instead to another organization. My interests and priorities have changed. I'm dissatisfied with the organization. My financial situation changed, so I couldn't afford to give again, which just means I couldn't afford to give to you again. I was dissatisfied with the use of my previous gift. Now look at this. Out of the top 10, the least cited reason is solicitation overreach, as in I was asked too often. The number one thing that we're all scared of, we're asking too much of our donors, is actually the thing that they're ranking the lowest in terms of why I didn't give again. Most of these other reasons we can do something about. Most of them we can do something about. So if we're being clear-eyed about, hey, why are people not giving to us anymore? Usually it's like, why don't they care? It used to be that people gave. Nobody really has this obligation anymore. Well, I think it starts in the mirror, right? So a lot of this stuff is stuff that we can do something about. Basically, donors are saying, I wasn't seen, heard, or understood. So how do we solve this? How do we make sure that in 50 years, giving isn't in the single digits? To be very clear, I don't have all the answers here. I'm just going to walk you through a framework that we're using. And it's basically through connection and growing hearts, right? Growing love for our causes. This is my favorite quote by Seth Godin. I use it all the time, almost every day. I use this in a conversation, which is people like us do things like this. This is the heart of what you want donors to feel like. People like us do things like this. I'm like you, you're like me. We're different from other people together, right? Nobody truly wants to be different than everybody else. We all want to be seen, heard, or understood. We all want to be part of some in-group. That in-group can be different from everybody else, but we crave connection. People during COVID died because of the lack of connection, not because of COVID. Some people died because of loneliness. We crave connection. And with many of our donors being over the age of 65, being over the age of 75, it's our duty of care to provide that connection. So the framework I'm going to walk through over the next 15 minutes here, it's based on our own research, our own client work, and this hypothesis that people want to be seen, heard, and understood. We call it the fundraising flywheel. And I'll walk you through this. But before, why are we calling it a flywheel? Well, there's a few reasons. I grew up in a very rural setting in South America. And at the time, a lot of electricity that we would have at home was through giant diesel generators. And the way we would get water was through these water pumps that had generators. Everything was very off-grid. Well, generators have a giant flywheel attached to the end of the engine. It's a big, heavy steel plate. When you get the engine going and the engine starts to slowly sputter up, and then it starts going and cranking, and it goes faster and faster and faster until it's fully spun up. That flywheel makes sure that the engine has momentum. It's a very heavy metal plate. If you imagine that plate, if you imagine a heavy plate and you trying to push that plate, at the beginning, you might be able to push it like an inch. And then you apply more pressure, 2 inches. You apply more pressure, and slowly you're spinning this big steel wheel. And the faster it goes, the less pressure you have to apply to make it go faster. And once it's in motion, you just have to keep it in motion, and you can do that with one finger, right? If you've ever pushed your kids around in a roundabout, it's the same principle. At first, it's really sort of heavy to get this thing going. Once that's in motion, you can just stand there as a parent and just with one hand, keep it going with very little effort. So that's why we call it a flywheel. It's based on creating and storing energy. That's what a flywheel does, which in this case is retain existing donors. We've studied up to 500,000 donor records recently. I can tell you with certainty that the donors you already have are more valuable to you than the ones you hope to acquire. So the flywheel is based on creating and storing energy, retaining existing donors versus necessarily capturing new energy. I'm not saying you shouldn't acquire new donors. You absolutely should. But when you go out and acquire new donors, it should be with the express intent on taking a first-time giver to a legacy leaver. A flywheel is ongoing and repeatable. It is more resilient against changes in momentum. So when you hit COVID, when you hit a pandemic, when you hit a black swan event, when you're facing an uncertain economy, if your flywheel is spun up, it can withstand some of that. If you're trying to spin up a flywheel in a down economy or when you're facing, hardships, it's going to be a lot harder because it's hard to spin up in the first place. And it takes consistency over time to get going. And it starts by, it's a 5-part flywheel. It starts by listening to our donors, listening to our community. This is gathering qualitative and quantitative data. And this is the real unlock. Some of us look at data. Data is how donors behave. Data is one of the loudest ways that donors speak to us, right? But qualitative data is messy. You ask 5 donors some questions, you get 5 different answers. And oftentimes what happens is, well, we had an event and the board chair's spouse said they didn't like this. And well, my in-law said they didn't like that. And well, we sent out this appeal, or we launched this campaign, and we got 2 phone calls of people complaining about the same thing. And now the sky is falling. We did something wrong. Well, qualitative data is really messy. You need lots of it to make sense of it. So you need to be talking to lots of donors. Don't just talk to 1 or 2 and base your entire strategy on that. Talk to as many donors as you can and ask them a fairly standard set of questions, and then log your answers and then look for trends. And then combine that with the quantitative stuff, right? It's going to help you. It's going to give you a hypothesis of what you should do, and then you test it out. And then the quantitative data is going to tell you whether you were on track or not. Only looking at the data is a low resolution picture, and only listening to donors, to what they have to say, is a low resolution picture. You need both to have a high definition picture. The next part is engaging. This is actually nurturing community by getting together. A community gets together. That's what a community does. If you want a community of supporters, you have to get together. I'm not talking about golf tournaments necessarily. I'm not talking about galas necessarily. But you need to have some sort of participatory activities where people can get together. One of the definitions of community is communion. And I don't mean that in the religious sense, although it can certainly apply for those of you who are running places of worship and churches, but communion as in communing with other people. We need each other. We crave connection. You need to create spaces where people can commune with each other. Listening and engaging often looks very similar, right? They're oftentimes bleeding into each other. And the important part is that you build participation here. It's asking the right people for the right things. Notice that asking is 1/5 of the equation. And that is because if you do all the other things well, you've earned your right to ask. You don't have to be ashamed of asking. Sometimes when you're like, I don't want to ask them. Well, what does that say about the way you've treated them? If you've treated them well, if you've listened, if you've engaged, if you've thanked, you've reported, you should be so confident and so bold in your ask because you've earned that right. Asking the right people for the right things. Oftentimes that is monetary, but not always. And we're going to open a story loop when we ask. And that's important because now you're inviting people into a story. And the way that they can help is by taking a specific and meaningful action to help you solve a big, giant problem in the world. That's why you exist. There's a big, giant problem in the world. You're solving it. If there wasn't, you wouldn't have to go to work tomorrow. An arts organization at the beginning of COVID said, well, we're going to take a backseat here. We don't think that arts is really the top priority for people during COVID. Really? What does the arts do for us? Like, you are solving a big problem in the world. We need artists. Artists point us toward truth. Artists sometimes illuminate things that we didn't see before. Artists give us beauty that we need to escape from the despair. Sometimes artists let us escape, right? Sometimes they let us do something really cathartic. If you're a nonprofit and you believe in your mission, There's never a time for you to take a backseat with fundraising because you don't believe that you're worthy of support right now. And there's more important things going on because you're making a decision for your donors. You're disqualifying them. You're making that decision for them. It's paternalistic. Thanking donors after they've given is really about celebrating generosity. Generosity is a good thing. Sometimes in religious communities, we don't do it. The right hand shouldn't know what the left hand is doing. If being generous is a good thing, why wouldn't we celebrate it? It could be sort of like false humility, but we should be celebrating this thing, right? Celebrate people for the fact that they're unusual people. People who give to charity, by the way, are highly unusual people. Most people don't give to charity. And then reporting back. And this is very important because reporting back is where a lot of your trust is built. A report back is time-bound, it's specific. It's an update on a specific gift. Remember why people didn't give again? I never heard from them again. I don't know what my gift did. I don't know what the outcomes are. I don't know what the impact is. I didn't feel like I was needed again. When people make a gift, that's a contract that you enter with them, that you are going to steward that gift well. And so you're going to provide an update, a report back. It's time-bound, it's specific. You're going to be responsive and genuine. Forget about putting your logo on everything. Forget about the email having to be perfect. Forget about everything having to be on brand. Send a text, send a plain text email, call somebody up. Be responsive in the moment as stuff is happening. If you think that donors are an important part of the team, and I think you should, then if something is worthy of updating your team, ask yourself, hey, would this make sense to update our donors? Showed up on a client call the other day. The other person was late. Sorry, there was this whole thing that happened at our place last night at 2 a.m. They live in the inner city. Last night at 2 a.m., guy showed up at our door and he's like, people are chasing me. He was shot. He didn't want me to call the police. So I just hung out with him. I took him to the hospital. That's an amazing story. That's why he lives in that neighborhood. So that when youth who are in distress can come and find him, right? The next morning, should that be an email to donors where the comms person or the fundraiser says, man, that is a really good story. Subject line 2 a.m. or subject line last night. Forget about the logo. Write a quick plain text email, 5 sentences. Hey, here's something that happened last night, and because of your generosity, we're able to be there for this fella and respecting their privacy, of course. But that's the kind of responsive communication and updates that you should be giving to your community because they're an important part of your team. If somebody reads something in the annual report that they didn't know about, then you failed to do your job. And I don't mean to be harsh about that, but if we're waiting 1 year to update people on what has happened, then we haven't been treating them like they're an important part of the team, right? So we can think of ways to surprise and delight our community. We can send out ad hoc in the moment, not always planned or scheduled updates. This organization asked their donors, they said, hey, school's going to be out in 2 weeks. We run a school lunch program, but now that school's out, these kids aren't going to have the lunch program. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to set up in a parking lot and we're going to hand out the food throughout the summer so they don't go without. And on the first day, so donors gave a bunch of money to make that happen. On the first day, on a distribution day, they sent donors this picture and they said, here, distribution day, we did it, right? Doesn't have to be fancy, doesn't have to be long. It just has to involve donors so they know that they're an important part of the team. In Canada, about a year ago, some of you in the room might be from Abbotsford, a big flood, right? This organization saw the press conference. They're not based in BC, but they have donors in BC. They saw a press conference of the mayor saying, if you live in this area, you better get out. It's going to be a very tough night. 20 minutes after that press conference started, all donors got a plain text email saying, hey, I'm praying for you. Are you okay? Is there any way that we can help? We often recommend quarterly town halls for you to build completely in public. What are you working on? What are the progress on your goals? Share wins and losses. What problems are you facing right now? Ask your donors, volunteers, stakeholders, ask them to share ahead of time. Say, hey, would you mind sharing a few minutes? You can share financial updates. You can allow time for Q&A. You can repurpose all that content later. But again, why wait to do this once a year when you could be doing it real time and involve donors in the process? If you do this well, if you manage to follow this flywheel, and some of our most successful clients run through this whole thing 4 times per year, once a quarter. Once a quarter, they're doing surveys, they're engaging, they're asking, they're thanking, and then they're reporting back. And then they've earned the right to ask again the next quarter. This is an ongoing business process. This is something that is spun up and it's running. If you manage to do this well, then I think in a few years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, maybe 5 years from now, you'll look back at the strategic inflection point and you'll be happy that you've built a broad base of donors, that you've prioritized participation, you've prioritized lifetime value, and you've built a community of people who care an awful lot about the things you care about. I want to thank you for your time. You can email me if you want to know a little bit more. We're at buildgood.com. We've got a free training on messaging at 5minutefundraisingfix.com. And really the best place to reach me is on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn, and we do have the Build Good Fundraising Podcast. If you're into fundraising and if you're into podcasts, that's your Venn diagram.
Thank you, Mike. That was a lot of good information there. We have about 10 minutes until our break. So if anyone has the question that you'd like to ask now, I think we have a few minutes for that, but also recognizing that Mike will be in a workshop at 1:15, well, there'll be a lot more time to dig into some of these things. So if you do have a question now, you can go ahead and put it in the chat or raise your hand or unmute yourself. We would have time for a few questions now.
Michael, is there any way at all in which Anabaptist donors are particularly unique? Any way at all?
Yeah, it's a good question, Ron. I'm a little bit hesitant to answer it because the truth is I don't know. I think the advantage that all of you have is that community is sort of baked in from the beginning. And I think that sometimes people might be a little bit more reticent to being thanked. They say like, well, you didn't have to thank me. To which you should say, I know, but I wanted to. Yeah, I think if you're getting shared values right, a lot of this stuff is pretty universal. And obviously the values that might appeal to an Anabaptist donor might not be values that will appeal to somebody who's giving to another organization. But yeah, I hope that's not a cop out here. I'm just a little bit careful on sort of, it's all a generalization. So
right. Another form of that is you don't really need to spend time visiting with me or phoning me. Don't spend your time elsewhere. Don't waste your time on me.
Yeah. And again, to which you say, oh, I know, but I want to. So this goes back to the qualitative and quantitative data. If you ask people, I don't recommend that you ask people, do you want us to mail you stuff? Because everybody's going to say no. No, you don't need to mail me. I'll just give. And then later you look at, so that's the qualitative data. literally quantitative data. All the people that we asked, we asked them what their preference was. We haven't been mailing them, we haven't been emailing them, nothing. They said they would give. Turns out most of them don't give. And it's not because they're bad people or because they're liars. It's just because what people say they want and what they actually want, and what people say they will do and what they actually do, are often two different things. So when you're asking for feedback, you need to be, the kind of feedback you're asking for should all be related to why do they care, should be related to identity stuff, how do they see themselves, should be related to passions and interests. Some of the other stuff, you're going to have to look at behavioral data to see. If somebody never responds to a direct mail piece, well, that's a pretty clear indication that you probably don't need to waste your money on direct mail with them.
It looks like David has his hand raised. Go ahead, David.
Thank you, Mike. I resonate with what you've been saying, and I like the community sense, the sense of engagement. That all makes sense. I guess my immediate reaction is I already get in my mailbox, at least a half a dozen primary organizations to which maybe I get all their communication. Now what happens if they all want to be talking to me once a quarter? How do we deal with overload? I mean, this works great for one primary relationship, say with a donor organization. But what if we're all doing this well? Is there a certain point where the donor is just going to say, this is too much, I can't work with it?
Yeah, maybe. We're light years away from everybody doing it well, so I don't know. But that could be, that could very well be, which is okay. The folks that most align with you are the folks that you will be investing most of your relationship time with then.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat from John. How much time and effort should be spent trying to reconnect with lapsed donors who haven't given in several years?
Yeah, got it. So if you're doing acquisition, if you're going to spend money on new donor acquisition, I say you should start with the donors that you already have on file who haven't given in a long time. So if you are going to spend money on donor acquisition, start there. Generally speaking, there's definitely a point of diminishing returns. So I want to be careful not to be like, don't write them off completely. You definitely shouldn't. If you want to do acquisitions, start there. But there's definitely a point at which it's very clear that they don't want to hear from you, or they're not interested at the moment. At that point, we take them out of most communications. And once or twice a year, we do a lapsed sort of re-engagement effort.
A question from Janet, wondering if there are distinctions between Canada and the US donor base that we need to pay attention to when we have donors on both sides of the border.
US donors get a lot more solicitations than Canadian donors, a lot more. A typical US donor who gives to charity, because of a few reasons, because of the difference in privacy rules, somebody who gives to charity will end up being on a lot of lists that get rented out and swapped. And so if you're a generous person in the US, at Christmas time, it's not unusual for you to get 10 to 20 pieces of mail a day from different organizations hoping to sort of acquire you as a donor. So that's one difference. Overall, though, people are slightly more responsive in the US. Canada has a little bit less of a mature fundraising market because there is more government support, for one. We've got less charities. So the culture is a little bit different. But overall, I found that the that the US fundraising can be a little bit more aggressive than the Canadian fundraising. Yeah. Even in terms of legacy giving, in the US, it's like, well, you're going to die, so do you have a will? Where the Canadian approach seems to be a little bit more nuanced. And I don't, again, generalization, I think our American neighbors are just a lot more comfortable with that direct kind of language, where Canadians try to be a little bit more polite, and that, again, that could just be sort of fake humility. But yeah.
All right. Well, I think you let me know if I missed anybody's question or if anybody wants to pop in here quickly. Otherwise, I think we will head into a short